Welcome to Spiritual Journals. Today, I want to take a moment to reflect on the remarkable life of Hannah, a woman whose story teaches us about faith, perseverance, and the silent endurance of pain. Her journey, as told in the book of 1 Samuel in the Bible, is one of the most inspiring examples of resilience and unwavering trust in God's plan. Hannah's story resonates deeply because it speaks to a universal human experience, the struggle to hold on to hope and faith when life feels overwhelming. Hannah lived in a time when societal expectations for women were rigid, and motherhood was often seen as the ultimate mark of a woman's worth. Yet, despite her desire to have a child, Hannah faced the pain of barrenness. To make matters worse, she endured constant taunts and ridicule from Peninnah, her husband Elkanah's other wife, who did not hesitate to highlight her inability to conceive. Hannah's pain was not just physical or emotional, it was layered with feelings of inadequacy, rejection, and shame. However, what sets Hannah apart is not just the depth of her suffering, but how she chose to respond to it. In the face of anguish, she turned to God. Instead of becoming bitter or retaliating against those who mocked her, she bore her pain silently and sought solace through heartfelt prayer. Her unwavering faith in God became her source of strength, and her story reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope is never lost. Hannah's life is a powerful testament to the fact that our struggles do not define us, but our response to them does. Her story continues to inspire millions, offering a beacon of hope and a lesson in grace for those navigating life's trials. Hannah's silent struggle. Hannah lived in a time when a woman's worth was often unfairly tied to her ability to bear children. In ancient Israel, motherhood was not just a personal joy but a societal expectation. Children represented legacy, blessing, and security, especially in a culture that deeply valued lineage. For Hannah, this made her inability to conceive an overwhelming burden. Her barrenness was not simply a private sorrow, it was a public shame. It branded her as less than in the eyes of her community and even, she may have thought, in the eyes of God. As if her internal pain were not enough, Hannah faced relentless ridicule from Peninnah, her husband Elkanah's other wife. Peninnah, who had many children, took every opportunity to taunt and humiliate her. She used Hannah's infertility as a weapon, flaunting her own blessings to deepen Hannah's wounds. Peninnah's cruelty wasn't incidental, it was deliberate. She sought to crush Hannah's spirit, to amplify her feelings of inadequacy and despair. Imagine what it must have been like to endure this daily torment, living under the same roof with a woman who took joy in reminding her of her deepest pain. Yet, what makes Hannah's story so remarkable is how she responded to this storm of suffering. In a situation where many would have lashed out, fought back, or let bitterness consume them, Hannah chose a different path. She did not retaliate against Peninnah's cruelty. She did not lash out at her husband or at society for the injustice she faced. Instead, Hannah bore her pain silently. She carried the weight of her sorrow with a quiet dignity that reflected not weakness but profound strength. Imagine the emotional weight Hannah carried. On one side, she bore the pain of her personal longing for a child, a desire that felt as natural as breathing but remained unfulfilled. On the other, she faced the crushing societal expectation that equated her barrenness with failure. And finally, there was Peninnah's constant cruelty, a voice that echoed her own fears of inadequacy. Yet, even amidst this storm, Hannah's silence was not a sign of surrender or defeat. It was a demonstration of her incredible resilience, her faith, and her belief that her story was not yet finished. Hannah's silence was not passive, it was purposeful. She chose to take her pain to the only one who could truly understand and bring her comfort, God. In her quiet endurance, Hannah demonstrated a strength that is rarely celebrated but is deeply admirable. It's easy to respond to pain with anger or retaliation, but it takes extraordinary character to respond with grace, humility, and trust. Her silence allowed her to focus her energy on what mattered most, her relationship with God and her faith in His power to change her circumstances. Hannah's story challenges us to reflect on how we respond to our own struggles. How often do we let pain drive us to anger, blame, or despair? How often do we lash out at others, letting bitterness take root in our hearts? Hannah shows us a better way. She teaches us that there is power in bearing pain silently, not in the sense of suppressing it, but in choosing to channel it into prayer, faith, and surrender to God. Her silence was not the absence of action, it was a deliberate act of trust. It was a recognition that the solution to her suffering could not come from human strength or retaliation but from divine intervention. Hannah's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful response to pain is not to shout but to pray. Not to fight back but to let God fight for us. In her silence, she found strength. In her faith, she found hope. And through her perseverance, she found her miracle. Hannah's struggle is a timeless reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is strength in quiet endurance and hope in steadfast faith. Her response, turning to God in prayer. Hannah's response to her anguish is one of the most remarkable aspects of her story. Faced with deep personal pain, societal pressure, and constant ridicule, she could have chosen bitterness, despair, or retaliation. Yet, Hannah's decision to bring her burden to God in prayer sets her apart as a model of faith and grace. Instead of allowing her sorrow to consume her, she turned to the one who could bring healing, comfort, and hope. The Bible paints a vivid picture of Hannah's prayerful encounter with God. She went to the temple and, in her brokenness, wept bitterly. Her prayer was raw, intense, and deeply personal. She prayed so earnestly and silently that Eli, the priest, mistook her for being drunk. But when he confronted her, Hannah's explanation revealed the depth of her pain and faith. "I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." 1 Samuel 1 verses 15 to 16. Hannah's prayer was not polished or restrained, it was the cry of a heart in turmoil. This act of vulnerability and honesty before God shows us that prayer is not about saying the right words or appearing composed. It is about laying everything bare before the Creator, trusting that He hears us even in our most broken state. What makes Hannah's prayer even more powerful is the vow she made in the midst of her anguish. She promised God that if He blessed her with a son, she would dedicate the child to His service. This wasn't a conditional plea, it was an act of ultimate surrender. Hannah was willing to entrust her most precious desire back to God, acknowledging that her child would be a gift from Him, meant for His purposes. This selflessness and faith demonstrate the depth of her trust in God's plan, even when she didn't yet see the outcome. Hannah's prayer teaches us several profound lessons about faith and perseverance. First, it shows us the importance of bringing our pain to God, no matter how overwhelming or raw it may be. Too often, when faced with hardship, we turn to other sources for comfort or solutions, forgetting that God is always ready to hear us. Hannah's example reminds us that we serve a God who is big enough to handle our grief, anger, and questions. He welcomes our honesty and longs for us to draw near to Him. Second, Hannah's story highlights the power of persistent prayer. She didn't pray once and then walked away discouraged. Instead, she poured her heart out to God with unwavering faith, trusting that He would answer in His timing. Her perseverance is a testament to the strength that comes from clinging to God, even when we don't immediately see His hand at work. Third, her willingness to surrender her desire to God shows us what true faith looks like. Hannah didn't bargain with God for her own benefit. She recognized that any blessing she received was ultimately from Him and for Him. This level of trust requires incredible humility and a deep understanding of God's sovereignty. Hannah's response also challenges us to reflect on our own approach to prayer and faith. When we face challenges, do we bring our burdens to God with honesty and trust? Are we willing to surrender our desires to Him, believing that His plans are greater than ours? Hannah's example encourages us to shift our focus from our circumstances to God's power and faithfulness. In the end, Hannah's prayers were answered, and God blessed her with a son, Samuel, who would go on to become one of Israel's greatest prophets. Her story is a powerful reminder that God hears our cries, honors our faith, and works through our surrender to accomplish His greater purposes. Hannah's response to her pain is a timeless example of how prayer can transform our struggles into an opportunity to grow closer to God and experience His faithfulness in new and profound ways. God's faithfulness. Hannah's faith and perseverance were not in vain. God, in His infinite mercy and faithfulness, heard her prayers and responded to the cry of her heart. He granted her the desire that had seemed impossible. She conceived and gave birth to a son, Samuel. This was no ordinary child. Samuel would grow up to become one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history, a man who would play a vital role in leading God's people and ushering in a new era for the nation. Hannah's story is a powerful testament to the faithfulness of God. He is not a distant or indifferent deity but a loving Father who sees, hears, and responds to the cries of His children. In answering Hannah's prayers, God demonstrated that He honors those who approach Him in faith, trust, and humility. For years, Hannah had endured pain, humiliation, and feelings of inadequacy, but when the time was right, God not only met her need but also worked through her life in a way that impacted an entire nation. What makes Hannah's story even more inspiring is her unwavering commitment to the promise she made to God. Before Samuel was even conceived, Hannah vowed that if God blessed her with a child, she would dedicate him entirely to the Lord's service. And when that promise was fulfilled, she did not hesitate to honor it. Imagine the depth of her love and faith. It could not have been easy for Hannah to part with her long-awaited son. Yet, true to her word, she brought Samuel to the temple, entrusting him to the care of Eli, the priest, so that he could serve God all the days of his life. This act of surrender is a profound display of Hannah's understanding of God's sovereignty. She recognized that Samuel was not hers to keep but a gift from God, entrusted to her for a greater purpose. Her selflessness and faith in God's plan show us that blessings are not merely for our own enjoyment but are meant to glorify God and fulfill His purposes. Hannah's willingness to dedicate Samuel to the Lord reflects her trust that God's plans for her son were far greater than anything she could imagine. Through Hannah's story, we see that her journey was not just one of pain and perseverance but one of ultimate triumph. Her silent endurance and faith-filled prayers brought about a blessing that extended far beyond her personal joy. Samuel grew up to become a key figure in God's plan for His people. He anointed the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David, and served as a spiritual leader during a critical time in Israel's history. The impact of Hannah's faithfulness rippled far beyond her own lifetime, shaping the destiny of a nation. Hannah's story challenges us to reflect on how we respond to God's blessings and faithfulness in our own lives. Are we willing to trust Him with the things most precious to us? Do we recognize that His plans are greater than our own? Hannah's example encourages us to approach God with faith, surrender our desires to Him, and honor His purposes in everything we receive. Moreover, Hannah's journey reminds us that God's faithfulness is not just about fulfilling our desires but about working through our lives to accomplish His greater purposes. Even when His timing feels delayed or His plan unclear, we can trust that He sees the bigger picture and is weaving our story into something far greater than we can imagine. Hannah's life demonstrates that God is both a promise keeper and a loving provider. Her faith, perseverance, and willingness to surrender her blessing to God resulted in a legacy that continues to inspire us today. In her story, we see not only the faithfulness of a devoted woman but also the unwavering faithfulness of a God who always fulfills His promises. Lessons from Hannah's life. Hannah's life offers us a treasure trove of powerful lessons, rooted in faith, perseverance, and humility. Her journey from pain to triumph is not just an inspiring story but a roadmap for navigating life's struggles with grace and trust in God. Here are 4 key lessons from her life that remain profoundly relevant to us today. Faith in the midst of pain. Hannah's life is a testament to the importance of faith, even when life feels unbearable. Barrenness, ridicule, and societal pressure could have easily led her to despair, bitterness, or anger. Yet, instead of allowing her circumstances to define her or overwhelm her, she chose to focus on God's power and faithfulness. Hannah knew she couldn't solve her problems through her own strength or by fighting back against those who ridiculed her. Instead, she turned to God as her refuge, pouring out her heart to Him and trusting in His ability to work on her behalf. This teaches us a profound truth: faith doesn't mean the absence of struggles, but it does mean trusting God in the midst of them. Hannah's story challenges us to ask ourselves, where do I turn when life feels overwhelming? Am I focusing on my problems, or am I focusing on God's power? Her faith reminds us that even in our darkest moments, God is still in control, and His power is greater than any challenge we face. The power of prayer. Hannah's response to her suffering shows us the incredible power of prayer. Her prayers weren't a simple wish list or casual conversation. They were raw, honest, and heartfelt cries to the Lord. She poured out her anguish, her desires, and her trust at the feet of God, knowing He alone had the power to provide what she needed. What stands out is not just the depth of her prayers but the act of surrender within them. When she prayed, she released her burden into God's hands and trusted His timing and His plan, even when the outcome wasn't yet clear. Hannah's example reminds us that prayer is more than just asking God for what we want. It's about laying down our burdens, releasing control, and trusting that God's will is better than our own. It's through prayer that we invite God into our struggles, finding comfort and strength in His presence. Her story challenges us to deepen our own prayer lives, approaching God with the same raw honesty and faith, believing that He hears every word and is faithful to respond. Silent strength. One of the most compelling lessons from Hannah's life is the value of silent strength. While it would have been understandable for Hannah to lash out at her tormentor, Peninnah, she chose a different path. Hannah bore her pain silently, without bitterness or retaliation, and turned her attention to God. Her response teaches us the power of humility and grace in the face of suffering. In a world that often equates strength with loudness or dominance, Hannah's quiet endurance reminds us that true strength comes from within. It takes incredible courage to resist the urge to fight back and instead entrust our pain to God. Hannah's silence wasn't passive, it was purposeful. By remaining focused on God, she demonstrated that her faith and hope were rooted in something far greater than her circumstances. This lesson is a powerful reminder that we don't always need to fight every battle or respond to every provocation. Sometimes, the greatest strength we can show is the humility to trust God to fight for us and to transform our pain into purpose. God hears and cares. Perhaps the most comforting lesson from Hannah's life is the reassurance that God sees, hears, and cares deeply for His children. When Hannah prayed, she was pouring out her soul to the Lord, her anguish, her grief, and her hopes. God didn't dismiss her pain or overlook her prayers. He saw her, heard her, and responded in a way that not only fulfilled her desires but also aligned with His greater plan for Israel. This is a powerful reminder for all of us who feel unheard or unseen in our struggles. Hannah's story teaches us that even when it seems like no one understands our pain, God does. He is attentive to every tear, every prayer, and every cry for help. Hannah's life reassures us that our struggles are not meaningless and that God is actively working behind the scenes, even when we can't yet see His hand. Hannah's life offers timeless lessons about faith, prayer, strength, and God's unwavering care. Her journey from pain to purpose challenges us to turn to God in the midst of our struggles, to pour out our hearts in prayer, and to trust His timing and plan. It reminds us that silent endurance and humility are not signs of weakness but of deep faith and inner strength. Most importantly, it reassures us that God hears, sees, and cares deeply for us, working all things together for His glory and our good. Through Hannah's story, we are reminded that no matter how difficult life may seem, God's faithfulness never fails. Let her life inspire us to live with the same faith, surrender, and trust in His perfect plan. Faith in action. In Hannah, we witness the epitome of grace under pressure, a woman who silently bore her pain but never wavered in her faith. Her story is a powerful reminder that even in our darkest and most difficult moments, God is at work behind the scenes. He hears every prayer, understands every tear, and in His perfect timing, He brings healing, restoration, and purpose to our lives. Hannah's life challenges us to approach our struggles with the same unwavering trust in God. She teaches us that pain is not the end of the story, it is often the beginning of a greater testimony. Her faith turned her anguish into a pathway to God, and her perseverance turned her pain into a legacy of hope and purpose. Through her story, we see that God not only answers our prayers but often uses our trials to fulfill His greater plans. Let us strive to emulate Hannah's faith and perseverance. Like her, may we turn our struggles into opportunities for prayer, surrendering our burdens to God. May we allow our pain to become a testimony of His faithfulness and His ability to work all things for good. And may our lives reflect His glory in every season, whether we are walking through trials or celebrating His blessings. If Hannah's story has inspired you today, don't let it end here. Carry her lessons into your own life and share them with others. If you're seeking encouragement, faith-filled content, and inspiration for your journey, subscribe to our platform. Stay connected as we dive deeper into stories like Hannah's and uncover the timeless truths of God's Word. Thank you for joining me today, and remember, God hears, God cares, and God restores. Don't forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories and lessons.